Alright, welcome to a new episode of Happy Little Divs. My name is Dave Geddes, also known as Gedsky. Oh man, I'm excited. We're going to build the UI from Zelda Breath of the Wild, probably one of the best games that has come out in my lifetime. Let's check it out. So here we have Link playing with the wolves, and look out! By the way, have you ever wondered what the correct response is if you're ever attacked by a wolf? Some people think you're supposed to maybe climb a tree or throw a rock. Those people are dead now. The correct response is actually just to open up your backpack. Whew, close one. Okay, so here's the inventory UI that we're going to build today. Let me pause this here and say if you want to get the most out of this video, I recommend following along, downloading the Git repo, and building this along with me. In this first part, we're going to build just the structure, broad strokes. I like to always start from the outside in when building a layout like this. Then in part 2, we'll dive into those sweet details that make this UI so great. Let's start by looking at how this UI pulls in our attention with these bright red hearts, and then leads us over to this huge image of Link, and then down to this big bold description, and then up again to this grid of items, and then we kind of start all over again. It really does lead us to where it wants and keeps us in the UI. They've got this perfectly spaced grid, and we're going to use the new CSS Grid layout for this. They use consistent spacing all over the place, between these inventory items and between the far right. The little gaps in between and the little gaps there, it's just very consistent. There's also just very good repetition. This cool border effect is used all over. This white line is repeated several times. The top section that's a lot darker is very similar to the bottom section that's a lot darker. That repetition really helps. They're also just not afraid of white space. Got a lot of empty space in this UI, and that's a good thing. Helps it not feel so cluttered. Another thing I really respect is that they know when to break the rules. Normally everything just fits in its little box, but this Link guy, he's the warrior of light, and he's not fitting in any box. When you break the rules like this, you gotta really break them so it looks intentional, and they've done a great job with that. Let's do this thing. If you've got the files, make sure you're on the setup branch. In there's some assets that we're going to use. First, let's create an index.html and a zelda.css file. I'm going to use browser sync to start a little server that will watch for our changes. Let's open up both of our files and get coding. We'll use an Emmet shortcut here to create this HTML quickly, give it a title, and make sure that our changes are working. Good. I find it helpful to have a video of the game as our background, so that we can build the UI on top of it and make sure that we line things up in the right spots. One little trick when you do this is to give it pointer events none, so that as you try to inspect things in the DOM with the dev tools, the video is not going to actually get selected, which is nice. Okay, let's link up our CSS file, open our dev tools, and get this just the right size. Now we want to find a good frame for this video, find a good spot in it to set as our background. So maybe about 3 or 4 seconds in should work, and we can set t equals 4 to our video, and that will set it to the right spot. Let's also get rid of the margin and padding on the body and set everything to box sizing border box, just a way better default. Let's look at how we can break down this UI. I see this outer container, and inside of that we might have this top area, a section on the left to hold our grid items, and a section on the right for this other info, and this bottom area. Why don't we add some markup for those? So we'll have our container, the top, the left and right, and the bottom. And we'll add a CSS class for each of those. We're also going to want to just stretch our container so that it fills all of the height and width. And position absolute is still the best way to do that. We'll give it a border just so we can see it. Of course, we can't see it yet because our video is covering it, so we'll change the opacity down to 0.3. Let's also just assign a background color to each of these areas, just so that we can see where they are in our layout. Now, this outer structure of our app is actually a perfect place to use CSS Grid. And once we set our container to display grid, you'll see all the parts show up. Now, you might be wondering why they look like that. And actually what happened is by setting the container to display grid, the browser created a 1-by-1 grid for us. 1 column, 1 row. Then our divs started flowing into the grid. And as soon as the first div entered into it, That filled up the entire 1x1 grid. So the browser created a new equal height row for us and added our left div to it. But there were more divs that needed space, so the browser just kept creating new rows for us automatically. These are called implicit tracks, and with grids we can actually tell the browser exactly how to handle this situation. But for now, let's define an explicit grid of 2 equal sized columns and 3 equal sized rows. Now we want to make the left column big enough to hold all of these inventory items, and the right column can just take up the remaining space. We'll also want to get an accurate measurement of this top column. I'm using Xscope for this. Get rid of that border. Looks like it's about 86 pixels for the top one and about 58 for the bottom one. The middle row can just take up whatever free space is left. Ready for some grid magic? We're going to make our top div span 2 columns, and same with our bottom div to complete the outer layout. Isn't that sweet? Grids makes this kind of layout so easy. I love it. Okay, this is a good spot for a snapshot. I'm going to create a branch called setup. So if you're following along and maybe got something wrong, you can do a git checkout setup and you'll be completely caught up. All right, why don't we work on this top section now? Okay, let's build this top area now, starting with Link's hearts. Let's give him 13 so that he has enough to get the Master Sword. Sorry for the spoiler if you haven't played it. We've also got this left button, a location in the navigation, and a right button. And don't forget about the rupees. Gotta have those to get the sweet gear. Dude, no more spoilers. Sheesh. Just gonna fill in some of the text on these. And something I forgot to mention is that we can actually check out our grids in the DevTools in Firefox. This is a really nice tool to have, and is the reason why I'm using Firefox nightly for these videos. So we're able to view our outer container grid, but we're going to make this top section its own grid and visualize it in the DevTools. Planning out this grid, we're going to have 5 columns, one that goes by the edge of the hearts, one for the left button, location, right button, and the rupees. Now we want these outer 2 to be the exact same size. The columns for the left button and the right button can stretch to be as big as they want, and the middle column for the location, we want to be centered right smack in the middle. So we can see what we're doing, let's start by making 5 columns of equal size. Once we have that, we can start tweaking the columns to be the right widths. Get that to match the hearts. Center one about 100 pixels, maybe a bit more. Now the right one we want to match the same size as the far left column so that the center column is always in the middle, no matter what size our UI is. And we can leave the other 2 columns to equally split whatever space is left. Next, why don't we style these hearts a bit? I don't want to get into too much detail here just so that it doesn't distract from the broad strokes we're trying to do, but we can block out kind of just the general area where these are going to go. Now, these hearts, this heart container, the heart container is actually a perfect spot to use Flexbox. So we'll make this a flex container, and as soon as Link gets a certain number of hearts, then those hearts wrap to a second line. So we're going to make this flex container wrap the items. With Flexbox, we can control how those multiple flex lines are arranged. So we're going to bump this one up to the start rather than the default of stretch. And adjust a little bit of margin on these hearts as well. Looks about right. Let's get this text to show up in the right spots. Now grids have a lot of ways to control how things show up inside of them. So we're specifically going to use align self and justify self to control the position of this text inside of a grid cell. We can also use margin bottom and right and left to move things around for minor adjustments as well. For example, on this right button, I'll use grids align self end to drop it to the bottom and then push it up just a little bit with margin bottom and to the right a little bit with margin left. Let's style the rupees. We can center it with align self center, the most selfish attribute in CSS, and push to the right with justify self end. A little bit of margin just to offset it. That looks about right. Let's just add some comments to make this file a little bit more organized. and maybe collapse some of these. Now let's work on this left section. It's got its own navigation inside of it, which is actually one of my few complaints about this UI, having a sub-nav basically. Oh well. So we've got this inventory nav with a bunch of links in it. Give each of them a unique class name so we can style them later. Make sure you don't add an attribute called to the past on these links, unless of course you've got your magic mirror handy. Okay, let's style that inventory nav now. Give it a different background color just so that we can see it, and a height. We're not going to try to make this too exact because we'll cover that in the part 2 of this video in the polish phase. Do a little bit of styling on the title. Now the browser has a pretty cool color picker built in, if you didn't know. So we'll set it to green, but then over in the dev tools, we can inspect it and change the color as much as we want. Pretty nice. Okay, our title is looking pretty close. Just a bit more padding on both the left and the top to get it in about the right spot. Close enough. Okay, now let's style these links a bit. We're going to want to measure them after we get a color showing up so we can see. Looks like they are about 28 wide and 24 tall. So we'll set our height and width for those. Make them inline block elements. Let's get our links to show up in the right spot now. Bit of padding on the left to line up with the sword. Bit on the top to push them down. Not quite so much. There we go. Now this is a great spot for Flexbox as well. So we'll make this a flex container and then use justify content space between to kind of spread out these items. Then with just a bit of padding on the right to line up with the right edge of that star, then our items will be spaced out perfectly. Just like that. Things are looking pretty good. Let's collapse this stuff, get it out of the way, and start building this item grid. This is a perfect place to use CSS grids. We've got 5 columns, 4 rows, and there's a 10 pixel gap in between each column and row. So let's build it. We'll make 20 items really fast. Thank you, Emmett. We'll need a CSS class for both items and item, where items will be display grid, and item will give it just a background of black. Measuring these items, looks like they're about 72 pixels. So we'll define our 5 columns to be 72 pixels each. And we can examine that in the dev tools. Change the color so it can show up a little bit better. Now defining our rows, we had 4 rows, also 72 pixels each. Looks pretty good. We just need to move it over a little bit with some padding. Maybe about 200, too much. 198. A little padding on the top, push it down. Then all we're missing after that is some spacing to space out the items. And that's what grid gap's for. Let's check it out, and nailed it. Looking good so far. Once again, we can just add some comments to make this clean. Collapse the markup that we're not working on right now. And let's start on that right section. So what do we need? Looks like there are conditions that apply to Link, like his energy, his temperature, and whatever that thing is. We've got this big preview of Link and some stats. Inside of the stats, we've got the name of the item that is selected. Jumping down here, let's add some CSS classes for each of these sections. The preview, the conditions, and the stats. Give them each a different color. Our UI is really pretty and colorful now. And guess what? This is another great place for a grid, where we've got 1 column, 3 rows. The bottom row and the top row, we want to be a set height, and the middle row can have the rest. Let's make this a grid. Okay, so remember how that preview of Link is going to break the rules? By default, he's just one of the rows in our grid, but by making it position absolute, that actually pulls him out of the grid, making this grid only have 2 rows since we haven't explicitly defined it yet. But we'll come back to that grid in a second. First, let's get this Link preview to show up with absolute positioning relative to the right area. There's an image of Link in the assets directory that you can use. And no repeat, there's only one Warrior of Light. Just makes sense. Background size of cover, and there he is. Pretty sweet. Coming back to our grid, let's highlight it in the Dev Tools, changing its outline color just a bit. Alright, now let's define these rows in our grid. The first one is going to be about 150 pixels tall. The second one can just expand to fill whatever space is left. And the bottom one needs to be about 180 pixels. But now we have a problem. See, we've got a grid that has 3 rows and only 2 things to go in it. So it's only going to fill up 2 of the rows, which is fine, except that our stats, we actually want to fill up the bottom row, not the middle row. Fortunately, CSS Grids is super powerful and lets us define these areas in our grid and put our content in those areas. So we do that using the Grid Template Areas property. In this case, I'm going to give the top row and the bottom row a name. Conditions on the top, stats on the bottom. I'm using an editor plugin called Prettier that messes up some of this formatting, so I'm just going to tell it to ignore this part. Now that we've named areas in our grid, we can assign our content to a specific area, like stats. So now that div, despite being the second item in the grid, is going to show up in the stats area, which is pretty sweet. Let's quickly do just a little bit more styling on this. We're going to save a lot of this part for the polish phase, but let's just get the general structure of it down. There we go. Fix the z-index so it shows up on top of our link preview, and maybe change this background a little bit so that we can see it. Nice. The item stats has a few more things we gotta add. There's a type, it looks like, the stat of the current item you've got equipped, the stat of this item, and any kind of bonus. This one gives a climbing speed. Very helpful, by the way. Let's add just a little bit of styling to this info, not too much. Maybe change the z-index so we can see it better. Okay. Only thing we're missing now is just the description of what this item actually does. Okay, that's looking pretty good for the right area. The last piece to build is this bottom footer. All it has are 4 actions that the user can do. They can sort, they can go back, select, or rotate. Okay, so let's do just a bit of styling on the bottom area and on these actions. Make it black. Now this is going to be another area where Flexbox is going to really help us out. Flexbox and grids work so well together. It's unbelievable. So with Flexbox, I'm going to push these over to the right, set their height a little bit, align them to the center of the Flex container, give them some padding on the right. Looks like they need a width. About 85. Okay, there it is. Not so bad, right? Let's change the opacity of the video so we can see our work. Check it out, it's looking good. Ship it, Nintendo. JK, I mean, we've got a lot of polish to add to make this UI really shine, so definitely stick around for part 2. But look at this. This is a solid layout from a fantastic game. If you were following along and got lost or lazy, or all of this just made you go and play your Switch, then you can do a get checkout structure and you'll be caught up to this point. Now, let's be real. There's only one way to really master Flexbox, and that's by shooting zombies with a crossbow controlled by Flexbox. This is a free story course that I built for you. It's at flexboxzombies.com. Go kill some zombies and come back as a master of Flexbox. If you want to master CSS grids and build any kind of layout you can imagine, then definitely pre-order my next story course, gridcritters.com. It is absolutely awesome. I think you're going to love it. If you're a fan of my work, this is the best way that you can show your support. Well, you rock. Thanks for watching.